So the next topic we can look at is how motor tracts carry commands to muscle effectors along different types of motor pathways. And we'll start out by looking at the different types of neurons that either generate these signals or carry these signals directly to a skeletal muscle effector. So there are two major types of neurons that are found in our motor pathways, and these are the upper motor neurons and the lower motor neurons. Upper motor neurons have their cell bodies somewhere in the brain, and this can be in the primary motor cortex of the frontal lobe of the cerebrum, or it can be somewhere in the brain stem, in the midbrain, the pons, or the medulla. And our upper motor neurons will carry a signal, so they will initiate our motor signal and carry that signal along their axons, and that signal will travel either to the brainstem, or that signal can travel down into the ventral horn of gray matter in the spinal cord. And once here, our upper motor neuron can signal the second neuron in our motor signaling pathway, which is the lower motor neuron. And the lower motor neuron will either have its cell body in one of the motor nuclei of the cranial nerves in the brainstem somewhere, so again in the pons or the medulla or even superiorly up in the midbrain. Or we can have our lower motor neuron having its cell body in the ventral horn of the gray matter in the spinal cord. And in either case, our lower motor neuron is going to be able to directly now carry this signal, this motor command, directly to a skeletal muscle effector. And lower motor neurons always excite the skeletal muscle effector to contract. So these are always sending excitatory signals. Upper motor neurons can send either excitatory or inhibitory signals. So it can either tell our lower motor neuron to make a signal, or it can prevent our lower motor neuron from signaling. And just like in our sensory tracts, most of our upper motor neurons will have axons that decussate as they approach their lower motor neurons that they are signaling. So just like in our sensory tracts, most of the axons in these pathways, but not all, will decussate. They will swap sides, and we'll have decussation of the axons of our upper motor neurons. The first pathway we'll look at is the corticobulbar tract. And for this pathway, our upper motor neurons are going to be sitting in the primary motor cortex of the frontal lobe of the cerebrum, and the cell bodies of these neurons are going to initiate a signal that's going to travel along their axons, inferiorly away from the cerebrum, and towards the nuclei of cranial nerves in the midbrain, or they can continue down through the cerebral pedicles to the pons, or even down to the cranial nerve nuclei that sit in the medulla oblongata. And once here, our upper motor neurons can send a signal to the lower motor neurons, again, whose cell bodies are sitting in the cranial nerve nuclei of the midbrain, the pons, or the medulla, so specifically the nuclei for cranial nerves 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 11, or 12, which have motor functions. And these lower motor neurons will carry the signal towards a skeletal muscle effector. And which skeletal muscle effector depends on which cranial nerve nuclei has lower motor neurons that have been signaled. So just generally we can say that these lower motor neurons are going to be sending signals to skeletal muscles in the face, so you can control your facial muscles, to the tongue, as well as to the skeletal muscles of the eyes, and also some skeletal muscles of the neck. In the corticospinal tract, our upper motor neurons can follow two different routes. So one potential pathway that the upper motor neurons can follow is that our upper motor neuron can initiate a motor signal and send that signal along its axon, which descends through the central nervous system, so it moves inferiorly away from the cerebrum, through the midbrain, through the cerebral peduncles of the midbrain, inferiorly through the pons, and inferiorly into the medulla oblongata. And then one possibility is that the axon of our upper motor neuron decussates at the medulla, so it swaps sides at the medulla, and then continues to move inferiorly into the spinal cord. And so from here, in the spinal cord, our axon is going to travel into an area in the lateral column of white matter through a pathway called the lateral corticospinal tract until that axon reaches a level of the spinal cord where it is going to signal a lower motor neuron. And that lower motor neuron will be having its cell body sitting in the ventral horn of gray matter in the spinal cord, and its axon will leave the spinal cord through the ventral root and go out into the spinal nerve and out to some skeletal muscle effector. So that's one possibility. The second possibility is that we have an upper motor neuron whose cell body is in the cerebral cortex, and its axon now again descends inferiorly through the central nervous system, through the cerebral peduncles of the midbrain, through the pons, and through the medulla. But the other possibility is that our axon does not decussate. And so most axons do swap sides, but some of them do not. So our second possibility is that the axon does not decussate, it doesn't swap sides, and instead it continues down inferiorly through the medulla, and when it enters into the spinal cord, it goes into the ventral column of white matter, and through a pathway called the anterior corticospinal tract. And so once in the spinal cord, our axon of our upper motor neuron will synapse with a lower motor neuron. And it does typically decussate at this point to do so. So once in the spinal cord, the axon does typically swap sides and contact a lower motor neuron on the opposite side. And our lower motor neuron will have its cell body in the ventral horn of gray matter in the spinal cord. And again, its axon will leave the spinal cord to signal a skeletal muscle effector that's being innervated by that spinal nerve. In our rubrospinal tract, our upper motor neuron has its cell body sitting in the midbrain. So different from the previous two, where the upper motor neuron cell body was in the cerebrum. For the rubrospinal tract, the cell body of our upper motor neuron sits in the midbrain, specifically in an area called the red nucleus of the midbrain. And so signals that are initiated by this upper motor neuron here travel along its axon inferiorly and actually decussate in the midbrain. So just before our axons leave the midbrain, they do swap sides. And from here they travel along a pathway called the rubrospinal tract, which descends through the pons and through the medulla oblongata, and eventually down through the spinal cord, through the lateral column of white matter, until the axon reaches the gray matter of the spinal cord. And here our upper motor neuron will synapse with an interneuron that carries a signal over to our lower motor neuron, whose cell body, as always, sits in the ventral horn of the gray matter in our spinal cord. And this lower motor neuron is going to carry the signal away from the spinal cord, through the ventral root and through the spinal nerve, off to a skeletal muscle effector. And in the case of the rubrospinal tract, these signals that are initiated up in the midbrain are controlling involuntary aspects of our skeletal muscle. So these signals are controlling the muscle tone in the upper limbs or the arms, and also subconscious regulation of the movements produced in the upper limbs. So for our final motor pathway, we'll look at the reticulospinal tract. And in this motor pathway, our upper motor neurons sit in the reticular formation of the pons and in the medulla. And so our upper motor neurons, again, can follow two different types of pathways, depending on where they sit. So if we have our upper motor neuron in the pons, its axon is going to move away from the pons in the reticular formation, inferiorly through the medial reticulospinal tract. So it'll move away from the pons through the medulla and down into the spinal cord. And in the medial reticulospinal tract, it's going to enter into the ventral column of white matter and continue to descend until it reaches a level of the spinal cord that has a lower motor neuron with which it's going to synapse. And once it reaches the appropriate level of the spinal cord, it will synapse with a lower motor neuron whose cell body sits in the ventral gray horn, and that lower motor neuron can then be signaled by the upper motor neuron. The other place we can find an upper motor neuron is in the reticular formation of the medulla. And so in this case, again, our cell body sits in the brainstem, in this case in the reticular formation of the medulla oblongata, and its axon now extends through the lateral reticulospinal tract, away from the medulla, and into the lateral column of white matter, where it continues along this lateral reticulospinal tract, until it reaches a level of the spinal cord where it's going to synapse with a lower motor neuron whose cell body sits in the ventral horn of the gray matter, and that lower motor neuron can then send the signal off to a skeletal muscle effector. And in the case of the reticulospinal tract, regardless of which pathway our upper motor neuron takes, the lower motor neurons contact skeletal muscles for the same function, which is to maintain skeletal muscle tone. So this is an involuntary action that's being produced by these lower motor neurons due to signals that are originating from upper motor neurons in the reticular formation of the pons and of the medulla.